I'm just going to give those late and happy arrivals a moment to sit down before we begin. Welcome to you all. Lovely to see such a good turnout for our final Noisy Thinking of 2014. It's all gone very quickly. Another year starts in January, another whole set of Noisy Thinkings to look forward to. Before I begin, I want to say a couple of really important thank yous. The first one is to Google for hosting us once again this evening in this lovely room with great catering and so charming and so wonderful to us all the time. And say also thank you to Flamingo, who have been our sponsor for Noisy Thinking this year and last and the previous year, and without whom I think Noisy Thinking would just be a very pale whisper of its actually very vibrant self. And it's particularly important because, as I'm sure almost all of you know, the APG is a not-for-profit organisation. We run purely for the benefit of our members. We don't make any money, we don't make any profit as such. And we try to keep all our prices as low as possible to make it as accessible to everybody. And for example, Noisy Thinking is free for members. And there's no other industry event which is free to its members. So it's particularly important, I think, for us to say that without Flamingo and without Google and those sorts of very kind of public-spirited and thoughtful and wonderful organisations, we wouldn't be here this evening in this way. So I'd like to do a round of applause for both of those. In January, we have the very exciting announcement that the APG is changing its identity in line with the launch of our 2015 Creative Strategy Awards. And more about that anon, but it's going to be all about fostering a much greater sense of community amongst planners and strategists in London in particular, but around the globe as well. And we're going to be doing that online and offline with a new website and a party, of course. So on the 29th of January, you are all invited here for the launch event and a party to get to meet more planners and strategists who have not met before. So put it in your calendar. And so to this evening's Noisy Thinking. I guess in the year where we had the Ice Bucket Challenge and the week where Radio 4, much beloved to me, did a whole programme on the moral complexities of the Sainsbury's ad, it seems a good time to ask the question, what makes an idea influential? And I guess those penguins have had some influence as well. So we have three wonderful speakers this evening. We have Chris Gallery on stage with the APG for the first time in probably 4 or 5 years, I think. He, as you probably know, is Joint Head of Strategy at Mother. He's also an APG Gold and Grand Prix winner. There aren't many of those, so we're particularly lucky to have him this evening. And with his background of working on campaigns such as Money Supermarket and Stella Artois, I think he's going to have some very interesting things to say to us. Don Boyd, Head of Strategy and Planning at Adam and Eve. I think almost all of you know him. He's an APG enthusiast. He's our treasurer. He's a part-time DJ. He's also a guitar hero, so they say. And he's here tonight not to talk about those things, but to, I hope, lift the curtain on what goes on at Adam and Eve DDB and helps them do those wonderful things with penguins and white horses for the likes of John Lewis and Mulberry. Finally, Tracey Follows, our APG chair, philosopher, author, social media polymath, will give us a new sense of an answer to that question, and she's going to talk about sense and nuisance. And in addition, for those of you who've seen your flyer on your chair, she and John Griffiths are going to spend a couple of minutes at the end of this evening telling you about the book that they've written, which talks all about the pioneer planners and how they came to set up planning, and a wonderful history based on personal interviews with those who are still alive. And that's going to be very exciting, and they're going to come and talk to us in a moment. But in the meantime, Tracey's going to stick with influential ideas, and I give you our chair.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Hi! Haven't seen you for ages. Right. I'm not going to roam around the stage too much because I've got an argument I want to make to you, and I don't want to be an Ed Miliband and forget to mention immigration and the deficit or anything else that is pertinent to my argument. So you might create a hashtag for me, and then you know what will happen. Yes, I'm going to talk about how to make an idea influential, but I'm going to take a slightly different angle on it. For any of you that were at Noisy Thinking last year, do you remember we did a session on what is an idea? Remember that? Anybody there? There with that? Yeah? Well done. So that was last year. For those who saw it and those who didn't, you'll know that my take on the idea is that I think it's a combination of an is and an ought. So it's kind of a connection we make between how things are in reality and how we'd like them to be, how we think they ought to be based on our beliefs and values. So for me, an idea connects the present with the future. And that's really what I wanted to focus on today. Perhaps we should have done this the other way around and I should have come last and talked about the future, but we haven't. So I do want to talk about the future and specifically what will make ideas influential in the future. So let's just start with our understanding of what we mean by influential or influence. The obvious definition, if you look it up in the dictionary, says, well, significant, dominant, powerful, authoritative. Those are all the sorts of things that we mean when we say influence, and that is true. They do kind of describe an outcome of something that's highly influential. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find that there are a few other different meanings. The one I think is most useful here is to have an effect upon. And if we think in terms of influence, if we think about it as a scientific term almost, strictly speaking, influence is an electrical or magnetic induction. I think that's really, really nice because it kind of says to me that the idea of influence has a kind of pulling effect, something magnetic. Perhaps influence is the very notion of pulling people towards your idea. And it seems to me a really good way to think about influential ideas, given that we're in an era where we talk a lot about the death of push marketing and how brands need to create a pull towards themselves. So I would encourage us to think about ideas with influence as having that sort of magnetic pulling effect on people. And one of the reasons I like this notion is because it feels very illogical. That appeals to me. It's already placed influence not in the realm of the rational, but in the realm of the ephemeral. Magnetism is something we intuitively understand. It's kind of like a compulsion rather than a rational choice, a rational move. And I think that's a better way to understand the way in which influential ideas work, because some work better than others, right? They capture your imagination, perhaps more so than they do your intellect. I think some of the other speakers and some of the cases that I'll show you will make that point. So, you still with me? Okay, great. I've got two premises already laid out. The first one is that ideas operate in that sort of land in between what is in reality and what could be in the future. And the second premise is that influential ideas have a kind of magnetism, a pull. You know, dimensions that draw us towards something really attractive, which is in no way mundane. And it's this aspect that pulls people in and gets people involved in an idea. It seems kind of new. This is something we haven't quite seen before. And all I'm really saying is that the key ingredient for an idea being influential is that it presents something to us in a newly relevant and really quite exciting way. Hopefully this is going to work. Ah, yes, okay. This is a quote by Dr. Samuel Johnson. And I think he put it best. I use this quote all the time, by the way. It's quite dear to my heart, and it's the foundation of a lot of things that I believe in terms of planning and communication. And he says the two most engaging powers of an author are to make new things familiar and familiar things new. It's easy, isn't it? Well, we love familiarity and we love originality, pretty much in equal measure, I'd suggest. So this is true, I feel. And if you can show a new idea in a familiar way, or a familiar idea in a new way, then that, you know, fills the world with this kind of attractive, magnetic, sort of untasted reality. And that's what an influential idea is. So the question then is, what is new? I think the new thing, and we're probably just coming to terms with it as an industry now, is the fact that media is not what it was. Culture is the new media. Any brand whose messaging is sitting within the confines of traditional media alone is not creating an attractive new reality for consumers. It's not, the brand is not in a place in which it can pull people towards it. That's not to say that traditional media and traditional forms of media are dead. I don't believe that at all, but I do think they are evolving. And what they're evolving to is culture. So just to repeat, culture is the new media. It's already started, I think we all know it, but it's going to be so much more so in the future. And all brands will find that the way to connect with their consumers is to be in culture. So some brands are doing it already. I'm not going to go through the usual suspects. You know the ones. Well, Coca-Cola, just to take one example, probably the best example, with its personalised bottles. Now, that's not media. I mean, we might say it's owned media, but it's not really media. It's so much more than that. It's culture. It's sharing. It's matesmanship. It's kinship. You know, that's culture. And Burberry is another great example of using culture in this sense, and I'll come on to talk about that a bit later. So culture is media. That's the future. And no idea will be influential in the future if it doesn't get on board with this. It's a nuisance. Now you know why I called it sense and nuisance, hopefully. It's a nuisance because that's not how we're trained as an industry. It's not how we buy advertising. It's certainly not, particularly for those working in network agencies, it's not how we test or measure advertising, not at all. But there you have it. This is what is going to happen. And more than that, culture is really immersive in a way that media just can't be on its own, you know, in the traditional sense. And a really great understanding of culture, I think, includes all different kinds of culture. So technology culture, foodie culture, entertainment culture, politics, travel, science. I mean, you saw all of that, pretty much all of that, blended together and served up brilliantly with the Rosetta phenomenon, which is the Philae Landa. I mean, that was a really culturally immersively cultural, interesting experiment when it touched down on the comet. So to land my own point here, I want to talk about something called serial. Who is listening to serial? Yes. How good is it? It's just incredible, isn't it? So just to explain to those who haven't heard it, you can go and download it immediately when you leave this room. But it's a great example of how media is becoming culture. It's on episode 10. There's no episode this week, you know, because it's Thanksgiving. Ooh. What will I do?
Celebrating throwing out the Brits.
Pardon?
I celebrated throwing out the Brits.
Well, wouldn't you? As long as they don't tweet it. Serial is a weekly podcast. It goes out every Thursday at 6 a.m. So it's recorded in the States, and that's where it's distributed from. Each episode is about 45 minutes long, and it follows one fact-based story. And all the episodes are delivered on a weekly basis, and it follows the story as it unfolds. It's told by an investigative journalist called Sarah Koenig. They're all real. This is real. And she's taken on the case of a guy called Adnan Syed, who when he was, I think 17, 18, he was found guilty, and he's now serving his time in Maryland Correction Centre for murdering his then high school sweetheart girlfriend, Hae-Min Lee. That was in 1999, and she takes up the case, and we follow her, retracing the events around the murder, tracking down the witnesses, finding new witnesses, people that the police didn't even bother to talk to, talking to other suspects, but also going through police case notes, forensics. But the important thing is we follow her emotionally. So through all the episodes where she becomes convinced and then unconvinced of these different theories and then convinced again. And it's quite a roller coaster. I listen to it when I'm walking my dog because it's 45 minutes and it's just brilliant to listen to a podcast like that. And it's like nothing else. Listeners, you see, can live tweet as the episode unfolds. There's a thing called Slate. I don't know if people know about Slate, but Slate sort of tune in every week and then they make their own podcast of the podcast. You can go onto the Facebook pages of the real characters, the real people who were involved, and we don't know who the murderer is yet, but you can follow these people and you can discuss your own theories, particularly on Reddit. That's where most people seem to go. What's the point? The point is that it's become the most popular podcast in the world. even more so when you all tune in, when you leave this room. So I got a little video, I think, that explains this better than I can. You play the video?
Oh my God, John, you know that new podcast, Serial? I am obsessed with it.
Oh my God, I love that podcast so much. That is all I can talk about with any of my friends right now. Do you know there's a subreddit where people post like theories they have about what's going on in the podcast? It's incredible.
Oh my God, I love that subreddit. I've read every single post on it. In fact, I've even started reading this other subreddit, which is about the subreddit. So on the other subreddit about the subreddit, they kind of post theories about like what's going on the subreddit. It's so good.
If you love that subreddit, you will absolutely love this Slate podcast that they just put out. Basically, they wait until the Serial podcast comes out, and then they make their own podcast where they talk about the Serial podcast.
Dude, don't tell me about that Slate podcast. I love that Slate podcast. I've listened to every episode. In fact, I've even started listening to a podcast that's about the Slate podcast. So every week when the Slate podcast comes out, this podcast also comes out and talks about what they're talking about on the Slate podcast.
Oh yeah, like how in the original podcast, Sarah and Dana recreate the route that was taken on the day of the murder. Well, in the Slate podcast, they recreate Sarah and Dana recreating the route.
Oh my God, that episode was so good. On the podcast about the podcast about the podcast, they also tried to recreate the Slate guys recreating Dana and Sarah recreating the route that they took on the day of the murder, but they just got lost. Oh, I don't know if you've seen, but the host of the show, Sarah Koenig, has been doing all these interviews where she talks about what it's like to host the show. They're so interesting.
Listen to me. I've read every single one of those interviews. Do you understand me? In fact, I've read so many, they're not enough. I've started reading interviews with another woman who just happens to be named Sarah Koenig, where she talks about the interviews with real Sarah Koenig, and also just what it's like to be named Sarah Koenig.
Oh, does she like being named Sarah Koenig?
She does. Oh my God, I'm obsessed with this conversation. I mean, the one we're having, and you should totally check out this conversation just over here where they're presenting theories about what they think we're talking about.
Oh my God, yeah, I'm obsessed with that conversation.
So here's a theory I have, and it might not make any sense at all, but I think that Sal and John are talking about how much they love the podcast Serial.
Oh my God, I love that conversation. And the subreddit.
I don't know what's going on with those cups. But this kind of storytelling, harnesses different forms of media in order to create a much more immersive effect. So it can be video or audio or text or games or gossip, or just a combination, social media. The thing is, the combination, it kind of becomes part of culture rather than sitting in some media. And that's what pulls us into it and gives us the opportunity to go deeper and deeper and get more and more obsessed, like these guys and me. As we participate in creating the idea, it's an idea that is operating in the culture. But there's an even bigger change coming, an even more potent change, potent trend, in fact. And that's going to determine, even once your idea is in the culture, whether that idea is influential or not, I believe. And that's this. Thanks to technology or interconnectivity or social media or digital or the Internet of Things, whatever you want to call it, we're entering a new age of much more sophisticated communications. I mean, we know that. But I think what we're actually entering is the century of the sensory, where things take on a completely different complexion. We all know that digital technologies have allowed us to create layers and layers of communication onto what could sometimes feel now like just bare bones of ideas. We can now enjoy much more immersive media culture, richer, deeper connections through a myriad of experiential effects. So apart from Serial, I mean, there's loads of things going on. You use all this every day. Online magazine editorials that allow us to shop straight from the page by clicking on what the model's wearing. Augmented reality that allows us to see the past whilst we're walking down the street. Google Glass, which creates around us this kind of bubble of knowledge about how, where, why, and what we're experiencing. Yeah, I can already tell everyone in my social network what I'm reading, what I'm listening to, what I just bought. Don't really want to do that. But I'm literally sharing the digital space and the physical space around me. I'm in a relationship with the Internet of Things, whether I like it or not. We all soon will be. This interconnected experience of the world is due to get much more immersive. and sensory. That's the point. So once we're using sensors and not just exchanging information, once we're actually sensory and we're exchanging emotions and moods and feelings, it's going to be a very different world. No longer will we be engaged in culture, we'll be really inextricably involved in it. So you can think of it like a codependent relationship, not with another person, but with everything around and about in your world. Yeah, our senses will be really stimulated. And I think this is really exciting because for the first time we'll be switching ourselves on. So you know how people say we only use about 10% of our brain? I think some people use a lot less, but anyway. And some people a lot more. Well, perhaps we'll come to think that we have, up until now, only used 10% of our senses. I think that's the change. Of course, not all our senses are equal. Well, we know that. We can rank them in importance. But by far, the most important is our sight, our visualization. It's about 40% of our sensory abilities. But it's closely followed by smell, then sound, then taste, and then touch. Touch is the least important, interestingly. But contrast this with how marketers deploy their media these days. 78%, so nearly 80% is deployed in visual media alone. So smell, sound, touch, is all very minimal investment, if anything. That's about to change. This is why I think it's quite important. In a Harvard Business Review article a few years back, and I've looked for it and I can't find it, but I think if you look it up, I think it was called something like, "Why do satisfied customers still leave?" Which is a really good question, because they do. But they analysed what it was that delighted customers, what kept them loyal over and above the satisfaction, just the straightforward satisfaction of having a service delivered to them. And what they found was that there were 3 key elements that kept customers attracted, connected, bonded to brands. The first was a feeling of being in control. The second was a feeling of being cared for. And the third was a feeling of feeling pleased. So in control, I think we can, kind of now deliver through data and allowing people to own their own data. Feeling cared for, we can probably, and we are increasingly catering for that through customer service departments, but also social listening and lots of other things that are happening with technology. But making someone feel pleased, well, that's a bit more tricky, right? You can do nice things for all of your customers, but it's pretty costly if you want to do that for every single individual one. Or you could create a really immersive experience that makes them feel really pleased in whatever way seems appropriate to your brand. So, of course, when I say sensory, I mean more than just the senses. I mean all of the atmospherics that can be created in and around one's personal environment that renders it just that bit more pleasing. Now, the funny thing is, there was a time when this industry was very good at creating ideas that appealed to the senses. So just a little bit of history, which I found fascinating. Within the parameters of traditional media, I mean. So sorry to those at JWT who've heard this before, because I banged on about it for about 2 years when I was there. But for the sake of everyone else, when I look back at the 1965 brief for Mr. Kipling by Stephen King, which was, by the way, 39 pages long, because it was a proper brief, it listed 9 responses that the idea needed to elicit from customers, consumers. 3 of those were rational, that's what we want people to think. 3 of those were emotional, how we want people to feel. And 3 of them were sensory. How do we want people to sense this stuff? And they included show the top and outside of the cake, so it's clear it has a homemade, uneven appearance. Cut a piece of cake, so it's a light and moist texture. And thirdly, superb taste. Now, you might think that all sounds quite naive, but the point is that the brief states, and I quote, "We want buyers to notice with their senses, to believe rationally and emotionally about it." We want buyers to notice with their senses. See, senses are the most important thing of all. That's what unlocks the rational and the emotional beliefs. And at some point during the 80s and the 90s, businesses and brand strategists decided that it was good enough to have a rational product benefit and just wrap it up in an emotional benefit. Oh, and sensory responses seem to fall by the wayside. But it's a really, really important means of creating an idea that will connect with people at a human level. Let's think about Apple for a minute. The greatest success of Apple products was in their intuitive use, right? What was different about them? It was touch, wasn't it? So the idea of touch, when everything else was sort of jabby button pushing, iPhones were the first really to revitalise sensory marketing, I would argue. And now by adding Siri with voice and FaceTime with visuals, they're allowing us to use more and more of our senses to communicate. iPhones also have iBeacon in them, of course, so they can act as transmitters and receivers for retailers. They can send you promotions, and they can customise things for you, but importantly, they're providing contextual information to help your real-world experience be that much better. In Japan, they've even worked out how to give your mobile phone a smell. You can see where it's all going. And the point is that especially once we're wearing this stuff, not holding it, it's going to be ultimately a sensory experience. So I say this, it will be in the design of an attractive, magnetic, unequaled sensory experience that will create the most influential ideas in the future. In fact, that's why for about the last 3 years I've been thinking about and saying, shouldn't planners be working in a pair, with a brand planner and a UX planner? One to tell the story, the narration, the narrative, and one to do the navigation, because you're trying to create this kind of immersive experience. That's what I'd do if I was setting up my own agency. It's a generational thing. So if you want to just have a quick look at this chart here, this shows the appeal of immersive experiences amongst Brits and Americans. And it's the last bit here that's most interesting, because, millennials, you can see, are much more interested in craving experiences that stimulate the senses, much more so than anyone else. The important thing about that is it's the millennials who are, or will very soon be, creating our brand experiences for us. So what could be happening? Oculus Rift, purchased by Facebook, that is an example of technology that plunges you into virtual reality, immersive entertainment experiences. I've already mentioned Google Glass. There's immersive theatre, that's really burgeoning, really big in New York right now. But did anybody go to the Kate Bush concert when she was here in London? Okay, that's kind of interesting, because she brought to life, using all kinds of multimedia, a really interesting theatrical experience, things falling down from the sky, all sorts of visual effects, lighting, sound, to make it feel like there were helicopters coming down from the sky, shifting, swaying scenery. And actually, when I was speaking to somebody about it, a friend of hers, he said they went around New York, they went to all the theatrical shows that they could possibly find over 2 years, because they wanted to create an immersive theatrical experience, and it was. Immersive retail, that's also here. So Burberry, when Angela Arendt was the CEO at Burberry, she opened the Regent Street store in 2012. And she said, I want to make it feel for our customers as though they are walking into our website. It's really interesting. That space houses 500 speakers and 100 screens, including the 22-foot screen in the main hall. I don't know if you've seen it. And periodically through the day, they're used for what they call a digital rain shower. And also RFID sensors are used to trigger multimedia content that just appears. The mirrors turn around and the screens play interactive footage from the runway. They're completely different, but very immersive experience. But more simply, I don't know if you saw it this week, Uber and Spotify have announced that they've found a way that they can work together so that you can choose the music that you want to listen to in your cab journey. Really simple. Sensory elements, whether they're sound or lights or smells or whatever, can be added to advertising and packaging. Not many people are doing it yet, but they will. And it helps marketeers create engagement, and it hints at a product experience. According to Kathy Barnes of the Faraday Centre for Retail Excellence, brand's impact increases by 30% if packaging design engages one additional sense. That's in addition to sight, visual, obviously. And by 70% if 3 senses are integrated. Can you imagine when all kinds of sensorial and immersive experiences can be tailored? Imagine if we tailored our products and those experiences by gender. Of course, everyone will want individually tailored, individually personalised experiences. Here's another one. Excuse me for the clunky piece of video. It's kind of, you'll get it. It's a piece of augmented reality, but it just looks a little bit clunky, but you'll see where this idea can go. This is something I'm going to show you from Total Immersion, an augmented reality program. This works with a standard computer and a webcam, and it triggers a 3D animation of whatever product you show to the camera on your webcam. The PC screen then displays the resulting animation. And the company is working with a host of retailers, theme parks, packaging companies, and now eventually with brands. So I'll show you their little demo. Can you play the film? It's great music, isn't it?
San Francisco Giants pitcher, Tim Lincecum. Baltimore Orioles outfielder, Nick Markakis. Philadelphia Phillies.
I mean, you get the idea. It's quite hard, I imagine, to take these sorts of videos and really relate it to people like this. And we may think that's quite a naive version of it. We can imagine it being very much more sophisticated in just a couple of years. And there's lots and lots of examples of this sort of trend, emerging trend towards immersion. So my pitch to you is simply this. What influenced people in the past is not going to be the same thing that influences people in the future. It's not. So forget the case studies of how brand X got Y number of people to do such and such, blah, blah. Those cases are based on old media, not a new cultural model. And they'll only be one-dimensional. They won't be talking about immersive experiences. So interesting as they may be, and I'm sure they are, they're not going to inspire the influential ideas of the future. And I think that's where we should be looking rather than necessarily the past. So go out, listen, look, touch, smell and taste your brands, and do the same when you immerse yourself in everyday culture. And I'd just say sort of dive in on a daily basis, and you'll find a whole, if you're looking out for them, you'll find a whole new set of sensory dimensions that you can bring into the experiences that you're trying to create for the brands that you work with. That's how you will create the ideas that influence people in the future. That's it. Thank you.